This is it. This is the finish line for the Legacy of Kain Marathon, the game I've been working towards since I started with Blood Omen 1. Now, when I came into the Legacy of Kain franchise, I had some experiences. I had played a little bit of Blood Omen 1, and I had played a little bit of Soul Reaver 1 when I grew up. And I owned Blood Omen 2, played it, but didn't remember much about it. Other than that, though, there's not much I really knew about the series, other than it was one of the most beloved cult franchises in a long time. And I didn't even think it was that much of a cult franchise until I really looked into the sales figures of the games. This is one of those series that has some of the most dedicated fans I'd ever seen, with websites upon websites pulling apart the Legacy of Kain lore and deep diving into the increasingly complex time travel plot that this series put before us. But it's time to come to the end. And the question I have is, will this game be more of the same? Moreover, will the plot make more sense? The more I started to play these games, the more I started to feel the Kojima conundrum settle in, which is a little self-coined term. Or if you want something a little bit more family-friendly, Kingdom Hearts Horse. Essentially a story so fascinated and obsessed with the idea of raising complex and interesting questions that they don't think far enough ahead to answer them. And if they do answer a question, it's usually followed up by a question 10 times as big and confusing as the one that they just answered. Additionally, the gameplay of the game started to burn me out a bit. They were formulaic past the first Soul Reaver, and any attempt to change that up, Blood Omen 2, ended up falling flat in every other area that the previous games excelled at. It felt like a weird trade-off. Continue the story every Legacy of Kain fan was chomping at the bit for, but also continue that formulaic puzzle boss new power gameplay loop they'd been leaning on for a few years now, or spice up the gameplay as they did in Blood Omen 2 at the loss of all of that world building, story, and excellent writing. Oh, and be forced to watch Kain drink blood every time. Just slurping up on that blood. We gotta watch. Yeah, that animation never gets old. Granted, there are reasons Blood Omen 2 was such a departure. What with a whole different studio handling it and all, but it still felt awkward and out of balance. So, with Legacy of Kain Defiance being the last game of the franchise, willingly or not, I was understandably cautious. Was I going to get what I expected, that same gameplay loop with some acceptable but not excellent combat? Or would Defiance finally do something new, change up the combat, and answer all of those loose ends they had built over the course of 4 games in over 5 years? Only one way to find out. Let's check out Defiance. What I'll say is Defiance was the game that Blood Omen 2 needed to be. By the time Blood Omen 2 had hit, the series was already feeling some fatigue. It's no secret that the Legacy of Kain games never truly hit the popularity a lot of people, myself included, believed these games deserved. And as each new game came, the story got murkier, more complex, and difficult to pierce. Honestly, thinking about it now, if the Legacy of Kain franchise were to be rebooted in some way, I actually think Kojima would make an excellent person to head that project. Regardless, any new player coming into the fold needed to have some idea as to what the hell was going on in the plot. And there was no real clear jumping in point after the first Soul Reaver. Blood Omen was mostly ignored, and while Soul Reaver was popular enough, Soul Reaver 2 made things really muddy in the story, and it didn't sell as well as I think they would have liked. And I firmly believe you'd have to have played at least the first Soul Reaver to enjoy Soul Reaver 2 fully, no matter how much they tried to fill the player in on the story while they played. And at this point, a new generation of consoles had launched, widening the potential for new players, and they really needed a game that embodied new ideas and a fresh take on the gameplay while still telling that same compelling story they had built the prior years. And it really felt like Blood Omen 2 was supposed to be that game, with a new focus on action, impressive new ways to display your power, goddamn blood drinking animation, taking place during a time where Raziel and the entire story could more or less be pushed aside. Everything screamed that they were hoping to pull in a slew of new fans with Blood Omen 2. But as we discussed in the review, what it did well everything else in the game, including its lore and setting, was completely forgettable. At that point, there were now 4 games that had woven such a thick, impenetrable wall of lore that any new player jumping in would have smacked his head so hard on it, he would have walked away dazed and confused. Enter the 5th and final game in the Legacy of Kain franchise, Defiance. I simultaneously love and feel super bad for this game. This is the game I would have brought in new fans with if it hadn't felt like it was already too late. I look back at all the critiques I had as the series continued, and I continued to review them, and realized that Defiance was what I was hoping for all along. Now don't get me wrong, there's still some stuff here that I have issues with, but in the end, Defiance was clearly trying to change things up, and it had a pretty monumental task ahead of it. Wrap up a story that many saw as overly drawn out at this point, create a game where you play as both the main characters who have starred in 2 games of their own and make it feel like equal attention was paid to both, and quell the boredom that had started to seep into the gameplay of the other games. And you know what? They did it. Mostly. The biggest and most impressive improvement is something that Blood Omen 2 tried to fix and, in my opinion, failed. And that was the combat. Up to this point, combat, barring Blood Omen 2, always felt serviceable. It was fine, sometimes even fun, but it never felt quite that smooth nor all that rewarding in the end. Hell, in Soul Reaver 1, I was skipping any and all enemies I could just to push forward because of how inconsequential combat had become during the course of playing it. But Defiance? Whew boy, this thing plays so nicely. The combat is easily the best combat in the entire series. It's fast, fluid, and impactful. Right from the outset, you feel powerful as the game opens up with Kain slipping his way into the Sarafan fortress to confront the Time Lord Mobius. A fortress, as he explains, that no man has been able to successfully penetrate. But Kain is no man. And that is put on display immediately. With Soul Reaver in hand, inhuman strength at his back, and telekinetic powers to further that, Kain is a wrecking ball. We clawed, we chained, our hearts in vain. We jumped, never asking why. We kissed, I fell under your spell, a love no one could deny. And by kissed, I turned into a vampire. Don't you ever say, I just walked away. I will always want you, Raziel. I can't live a lie, running for my life. I will always want you, Raziel. I came in like a wrecking ball. Any combat situation feels as though there are a multitude of ways to successfully finish those scenarios. As the enemies weaken, a giant splash of blood will eventually emerge from them, indicating they're as good as dead, and with the press of a button, rip the blood from their already wounded bodies and heal yourself mid-combat as you drain them. And long gone are those uninterruptible animations of Kain drinking with sweeping camera motions. Instead, from your current camera position, Kain will just pull the blood to him, and if necessary, you can stop the blood draining at any time, making you more maneuverable and giving you more options while the heat is still on. And the same carries right over to Raziel. Though he is a bit faster and more nimble than Kain himself in combat, almost everything I said can be brought over to Raziel too. Fast, fluid, enjoyable combat with his own unique combos, as well as replacing the blood draining animation with a satisfying one of Raziel ripping the soul straight out of the body of the man he was killing, and it just looks so good. This is easily the most fun I've had fighting in any Legacy of Kain game, and it echoes in some ways the Batman Arkham games that would come many years later, with the ability to take on multiple foes with single button combat that has depth and variety. I can only imagine what would have been refined should the series had continued beyond this, and it almost did with a game called Legacy of Kain Dark Sun. And on the topic of fast and fluid, movement in general feels overall more enjoyable. You feel much less like a tank, which I felt was a problem in some of the earlier games, and more like a character with actual direction and control over the moves that you want to make. But it also brings about the biggest and most glaring issue I have with the game as a whole, and it's the camera. For one reason or another, they decided that Defiance would get a fixed camera. No longer would the camera be following you in game, but instead it would be placed at a fixed point in every room or scenario, and you would see your character moving from that fixed point. Very, very similar to the original Resident Evil games prior to 4. And while on a whole it didn't bother me too much, there were instances where I wanted to rip out my luscious, gorgeous hair. 2 moments spring to mind in the early games specifically. The very first being the Sarafan Fortress that the game opens up with. The way that fortress is laid out is maze-like already, filled with a bunch of necessary backtracking and mild puzzle solving, which in and of itself isn't a crime. But when each camera angle for each room is wildly different than the one preceding it, after a few rooms, I would consistently find myself lost and confused as to where I was and how to get back to the place I needed to go. Especially since some of the pathways you end up taking become barred and impenetrable due to some of the actions you take throughout. But the most egregious issue with this camera style is the platforming. Sporadically throughout the game, you'll need to jump to very specific platforms, usually with Raziel, as you still use that reality warping ability that he's had for every game at this point, and make very difficult and narrow jumps in order to proceed. And the way that the camera is placed during some of these means that lining up a jump becomes almost impossible, as depth perception is basically ripped away from you, and you have no idea where on the plane your character is currently standing. This fixed camera single-handedly attempts to ruin any fun you had prior to this particular platforming, kind of like an ex-girlfriend who found out you're in a happy relationship and be all like, "I hear you're happy now. I'm happy for you, boo." Aw, thanks, Cammy. I appreciate it. Of course. Does she know you used to me like an animal from behind and call me a little kitten? No, she doesn't know that because you and I aren't together, and that was years ago. I'm gonna text her right now and let her know. Wait, what? How do you have her number? But as much as I hated the camera, it really is one of the few things that even threaten to put a damper on a really great experience. Of course, puzzles make a return and shake off the blackout binge drinking session that was the puzzles of Blood Omen 2. They return to something more akin to Soul Reaver 2, though I did find them a bit simpler still, though infinitely more complex and interesting than Blood Omen 2. Most of the more enjoyable ones come with when you play as Raziel and the twisting and turning of the realities before him, from physical to spiritual, and they're as fun as ever because of it. But honestly, it's Raziel and his shifting ability that caught me off guard the most. For reasons I can't spoil, Raziel no longer has the ability to freely, and I say that in quotations, shift between the realm of the dead and the living. Instead, now Raziel must find a corpse he can possess and force himself through sheer will to replace that body with his own. Functionally, nothing changes from past Soul Reaver games, but the visuals and change in tone in Raziel needing to possess a body is interesting enough that it stuck with me through the whole game. The Spirit Realm also got a pretty major overhaul and is infinitely more creepy. Everything is as distorted as ever, but now the quiet ambient noises of the land of the dead are occasionally replaced with whimpering, scared voices, begging or demanding that they not be touched. It felt downtrodden, and as though I was constantly being watched. It had a tinge of horror as I would go about solving a platforming puzzle, all while a voice echoed and screamed for its release from whatever hell it perceived itself in. Visually, the game looks damn good too, even though it is from 2003. We saw it in Soul Reaver 2 a bit, as the developers started to really line up their art style, going for something more akin to a 90s Dark Horse comic, instead of trying something more realistic, and because of that, the game has aged wonderfully, especially compared to other games from its era. The character models are bright and enjoyable to watch, and the animation, especially for our 2 protagonists, are a joy every time and don't drag on like in Blood Omen 2. To go along with that, the voice acting and superb script make a return, thankfully. Both Simon Templeman and Michael Bell are as Shakespearean and completely enrapturing as they always have been, and the story that follows is equally enticing. And you might notice I haven't really touched or recapped the story from Soul Reaver 2, nor touched the one in Defiance, and there's a reason. Now, I know that people are really torn on the ending of Defiance, and I can honestly see why. But without saying much about it, I actually think and really liked the ending, and thought it was a fantastic end to the saga of 2 characters I've been following for a couple of months now. And while it ends kind of open-endedly, it actually answers most of the questions I had with enough substance and thought that in my mind felt pretty final. And maybe a lot of that is because I knew Defiance was going to be the last game in the series, and that it is possible that not everything would be wrapped up in a nice bow. But to me, that's the beauty of it. The Legacy of Kain games from Blood Omen 1 up to now were never about getting that perfect ending or living happily ever after. They were stories about two characters who were, for all intents and purposes, in it for themselves, even if they had minor altruistic intentions. The story from start to finish was always about Kain and his desires versus Raziel and his need for answers and vengeance, and the web weaved between the two. To buck the idea of fate and to carve your own path, consequences be damned. So while I won't spoil anything, I thought the ending for these two fit perfectly. It fit thematically and along with the kind of the themes that have been set forth since the first game. And barring the miracle reboot or sequel directly to this game, this is all we're gonna get, and I'm happy with it. So the ending of Defiance was good, really good, for me anyway. And I know there's a lot of diehard fans out there who would argue and say that not everything was answered, and you're right, there are still some questions I have, but the ending felt satisfying for me, and I can see how this is the final bookend on the Kain and Raziel story. And Simon Templeman isn't with us anymore anyway, so we can't get the Kain that we would like, at least when it comes to voice talent. And as much as I would like Defiance to be the game I would sick on people who have never played the Legacy of Kain games, I have a hard time doing that. Even playing through Defiance, the way they try and explain what happened in the past 4 games is just still not enough. There's still questions and vagary in the way they explain things that left even me confused. Somebody who played all 4 games, that made me wonder, wait, what are they trying to get across here? I think the way I would do it if I was trying to introduce somebody new to this entire series is have them play Blood Omen 1, Soul Reaver 1, skip the next 2 and go right to Defiance. Which is weird because I did say I loved Soul Reaver 2 much more than Soul Reaver 1, but there's more important plot points in Soul Reaver 1 and of course Blood Omen just to understand who Kain is as a person and get a little taste of the time travel that was to come. But you can kind of ignore Soul Reaver 2 and Blood Omen 2, and you can definitely ignore Blood Omen 2, and go right to Defiance, as Defiance does a good enough job, in my opinion, highlighting the important topics of the 2 sequels in their game, and then wrapping it all up, and still maintaining the importance of what happened in those games. Even a little bit of Blood Omen 2 makes its way into Defiance and its story, which is a little surprising for me. But I would still say skip those 2, play the first 2, and then jump right to Defiance. I think that would be the way to do it for somebody who wanted to get the experience of Legacy of Kain without diving too far into the series. As for myself, I'm really happy I did it the way I did. And I'm really happy I did a marathon review series, sort of. There was a couple of breaks in between where I hit up a couple of newer games that I really wanted to talk about. But I would do it again, and I'm definitely going to do it again. Not right away, there are other games I want to tackle before I worry about a marathon, but I'm really pleased with how this whole series ended up, and I'm really pleased I did the Legacy of Kain games. I thought there would be way more content on Legacy of Kain on YouTube, and there just isn't. Not a lot of it anyway, or not a lot of quality anyway. There's still a lot of older stuff from like the early 2010s that kind of linger on the YouTube space, but not many people tackle the series as a whole like this. And I'm happy I was one of the first to jump in. So if you guys have never played Legacy of Kain, do it. There's so much to love here as long as you know what you're getting into with some of the older design mentality when it comes to that game. So I, the Honorable Judge Mathas, judge this entire series as innocent. I fully believe Legacy of Kain deserved better than it got. There was so much to love about the series, and while maybe the series didn't evolve fast enough with the gaming as a whole, there was a lot going on with its story and its complex themes and its questions of morality and destiny, and the gameplay was still good. And in Defiance, the gameplay is even great. I loved it, and I really wish I had gotten a better shot in the gaming universe, and maybe we'll get one day. Nosgoth doesn't count. So my question to you is twofold. 1, have you played the Legacy of Kain series, and what do you think about them as a series as a whole or individual games? And 2, is there a game series that exists that you felt or feel to this day is criminally unseen? I would love to dive into those because, as I said, I didn't realize Legacy of Kain was as ignored as it was in general. It was a series that I loved growing up to an extent. But I didn't realize it had not the fan base that I personally thought it had, which was huge. But maybe that's because the fans of the Legacy of Kain are so loud and ravenous they want more. And I can't blame them. I'm one of them now. Thank you so much for watching this marathon series on Legacy of Kain. It has been a wild ride, and I wouldn't have done it without your support and your love of the content as well. For all you Legacy of Kain fans out there, I hope I did your series justice. And if I didn't, well, you can let me know right down in the comment section below. As always, thank you to my patrons for supporting me over directly on Patreon. If you want some exclusive behind the scenes stuff and some early access to videos, as well as access to an exclusive Discord where you can talk with other people as well as myself, you can get that over on our Patreon right now. And there may be some new stuff coming along the line that is Patreon involved also. And as always, if you just watched the series, thank you so much. Your support and your views mean everything to this channel as it continues to try and thrive in an industry that is relatively oversaturated. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Be safe. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this episode of Judge Mathas, and thank you so much if you went through the entire marathon with me on the Legacy of Kain series. Wouldn't have been able to do it without you. If you want to see more content just like this, hit that subscribe button, and if you want notifications, hit the bell. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button. If you didn't, hit the dislike button. And if you want to support me directly and get some extra goodies along with it, head over to my Patreon page right below.